The wind howled across the scorched plains, carrying the distant clatter of armor and the faint, desperate cries of soldiers. Smoke twisted into the sky, black and thick, marking the remnants of battles long past, yet the ground beneath bore fresh scars, deep furrows where cavalry had charged, and the earth itself seemed to shudder beneath the weight of men and horses. At the crest of a small hill, standing alone against the chaos, was Jan Žižka, a man whose presence demanded attention even without grandeur or glory. One eye was covered by a scarred leather patch, the other sharp and burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce the storm itself. Every soldier who saw him would later speak in hushed tones of the aura he exuded, not fear, nor arrogance, but an unwavering certainty that the world could bow to no one unless he allowed it. Behind him, a small contingent of loyal followers shifted nervously, gripping their spears and axes, feeling the weight of what was to come. Yet they drew courage from him, for Žižka did not speak much, but his silence carried the authority of a man who had survived betrayal, exile, and the countless trials of war. The air trembled with anticipation, as if the land itself waited for the inevitable clash of titanic forces. In the distance, the enemy cavalry approached, a living sea of steel and banners, 100,000 strong, their hooves pounding rhythmically, shaking the ground like a drumbeat of doom. Their flags, bright and numerous, fluttered violently in the wind, displaying the sigils of kingdoms and lords who had long believed that sheer numbers could crush any opposition. But numbers had never intimidated Žižka. He had fought when the odds were impossible, and he had always emerged victorious. His mind, a fortress more impenetrable than the iron walls of any castle, had conceived strategies that turned weakness into strength, despair into triumph. He studied the horizon, noting the enemy formations, the angle of their advance, the rhythm of their approach. Every detail mattered: a leaf falling from a tree, the faint shuffle of distant cavalry boots, even the way the sun caught on the glint of armor. All were pieces of a puzzle he had been solving long before the first clash of steel. Jan's hand rested lightly on the haft of his massive war axe, scarred from decades of combat. The weapon had felled countless enemies, yet it was not merely a tool of death. It was an extension of his will, a symbol of his resolve. Around him, the ground was littered with remnants of old skirmishes, broken wheels, shattered shields, and discarded helmets, silent testaments to the lives and ambitions crushed in the endless struggle for power. And yet, he did not see this as sorrowful. He saw it as the canvas upon which the story of men was painted, where courage, cunning, and the refusal to yield could defy fate itself. His one remaining eye scanned the approaching horde with a calculating precision, seeing not individuals but patterns, movements, and opportunities. Each horseman was a note in the symphony of chaos, and he alone conducted the score that would decide life and death on this plain. Behind the hill, the sun began its slow climb, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Dust and fog mingled in the golden light, creating an ethereal haze through which Žižka's silhouette appeared larger than life, a single figure of defiance against an overwhelming tide. He shifted slightly, signaling his men with subtle movements, unspoken commands that had been honed through countless battles. The soldiers responded instinctively, adjusting their positions, readying the wagons and barricades that would form the heart of their defensive line. This was not just preparation, it was choreography. And at the center of it all, Jan Žižka stood, unflinching, a man who had learned that the courage to act without fear was more powerful than any sword, shield, or army. The distant roar of the approaching cavalry grew louder, echoing across the valleys, a sound that would have sent ordinary men running in terror. But not him. He did not flinch, did not hesitate, did not even blink. For Jan Žižka, the storm was merely a backdrop to the legend he was about to create, the first stroke in the story of the blind warrior who would stand against 100,000 knights and emerge victorious, not because he saw better than others, but because he understood the true nature of battle, fear, and unyielding will. In that moment, as the wind tore across the plains and the enemy drew closer, Žižka's gaze fixed on the horizon. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath, as if acknowledging the presence of a man destined to be remembered for centuries. Every eye in the approaching army could see the lone figure, but few understood the storm that raged within him. And as he raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, not in plea, but in preparation, the battlefield seemed to whisper, "Here stands a man who will defy the impossible, who will bend fate with nothing but courage, strategy, and sheer will." This was Jan Žižka, and this was only the beginning. The battlefield stretched endlessly before Jan Žižka, a vast sea of armored knights and mounted soldiers that seemed to blot out the horizon. The thunder of hooves grew louder with every heartbeat, a rhythmic drum signaling doom for anyone daring to stand against such an overwhelming force. But Žižka did not falter. His eyes, sharp with strategy and experience, swept across the field, noting the slightest rise and fall of the terrain, the pattern of enemy formations, the subtle gaps between squadrons that could be exploited. Behind him, his soldiers moved with disciplined precision, forming a series of defensive lines centered around the infamous war wagons, fortresses on wheels that Žižka had perfected over years of relentless innovation. Each wagon was stacked with soldiers, shields, and cannons, angled in ways that would transform the open plain into a deadly maze for anyone foolish enough to charge blindly. The enemy laughed, confident that sheer numbers would shatter these modest defenses, but they had underestimated the cunning of a man who had survived treachery, injury, and the harshest winters, only to stand unbowed before impossible odds. As the knights surged forward, a wall of iron and horseflesh, Žižka's mind orchestrated a symphony of chaos, his commands cutting through the clamor of the battlefield. Arrows hissed through the air, bouncing off shields and finding gaps where the enemy was overconfident. Hidden trenches swallowed horses and men, wagons pivoted to create impenetrable corners, and strategically placed obstacles forced the enemy to slow, stumble, and collide. From above, it would have looked like a carefully choreographed dance of destruction, every motion premeditated, yet executed with the speed and fluidity of instinct. Žižka's soldiers, small in number but immense in morale, moved as extensions of his will, their actions synchronized with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Every knight that fell, every horse that tumbled into a pit or struck a barricade, was not chance. It was the result of a mind that had learned to read the battlefield like an open book, turning disadvantage into absolute advantage. The enemy commanders, perched high on their mounts, could not comprehend the madness unraveling before them. Thousands of men pressed forward, yet at every step, they were funneled into traps designed by a man whose body bore the scars of countless battles, whose face told stories of survival, determination, and unyielding will. Žižka, despite the loss of one eye and later total blindness, saw the battlefield not with sight but with foresight, intuition, and calculation. He anticipated every charge, every maneuver, every reckless decision made by men intoxicated with power and pride. The wagons, arranged in complex patterns, became citadels from which his troops could strike with devastating effect, arrows raining down like thunderbolts, swinging axes cleaving the armor of knights who thought their numbers made them invincible. It was a spectacle of disciplined chaos, where every act of courage was magnified by strategy, and every mistake by the enemy was immediately exploited, widened, and turned into victory. Amidst the roar of battle, the clatter of metal, and the screams of horses and men, Žižka remained a figure of calm authority. He moved between wagons, issuing orders with measured gestures, correcting positions, anticipating the enemy's next move before it was even attempted. Each of his decisions was a thread in a web of cunning, ensnaring the overconfident enemy in traps they could not see. Cavalry units charged, only to be funneled into narrow paths where they became easy targets. Infantry tried to flank, only to be cut off by hidden barricades and crossfire from hidden marksmen. The battlefield, which should have been a simple contest of strength and numbers, became a labyrinth designed by a genius who understood that victory was won not by brute force but by intelligence, preparation, and the exploitation of fear and overconfidence. Hours passed, and the tide of battle began to turn. The knights, exhausted and demoralized, faltered under the relentless ingenuity of a smaller, disciplined force. Horses stumbled into pits, ranks broke under precision strikes, and commanders who had expected an easy victory began to despair. From his command point, Žižka watched with eyes that saw beyond the chaos, calculating the next move, ready to exploit every hesitation. His soldiers, inspired by his unshakable courage and cunning, held their ground and pressed forward, each action perfectly timed, each strike deliberate. By the end of the day, the vast army of 100,000 knights had been checked, broken, and forced to retreat, not through sheer numbers, but through the brilliance of a single man who refused to be intimidated, a man who had transformed the battlefield into a testament of human ingenuity and unyielding will. Jan Žižka had turned impossibility into legend, and the world would never forget how one man, outnumbered and outmatched, had outwitted an army of 100,000 knights with nothing but strategy, courage, and unshakable resolve. The battlefield lay shrouded in mist and smoke, a chaotic tapestry of destruction, torn earth, and the lingering echoes of battle cries. Yet in the midst of it all stood Jan Žižka, now completely blind, his world reduced to sounds, vibrations, and the instincts honed over decades of relentless combat. What would have been an insurmountable weakness for any other man became his greatest strength, for Žižka had learned to see not with eyes, but with perception, intuition, and the sheer force of his mind. The enemy, confident that a blind commander would crumble under the pressure of overwhelming numbers, pressed forward with renewed vigor, their armor clanging, banners snapping in the wind, and horses stomping the ground in a relentless cadence that seemed to shake the very air. Yet Žižka did not flinch, he did not waver. Every step, every word, every gesture was calculated, and even without sight, he could sense the ebb and flow of the battlefield with uncanny precision. His ears caught the faintest shuffle of a foot, the subtle shift of a wagon wheel, the distant whinny of a horse, and in those sounds, he read the movements of 100,000 knights as if he could see their formation with perfect clarity. Behind him, his soldiers moved as extensions of his will, confident and disciplined, knowing that their blind commander could anticipate danger, exploit weaknesses, and turn their desperate stand into a symphony of victory. Žižka's wagons, already legendary in their defensive ingenuity, were now instruments of a genius amplified by necessity. The blind commander had orchestrated them with such precision that each wagon became a bastion, a pivot, a trap, and a shield simultaneously. Cavalry charges, once terrifying and unstoppable, were funneled into narrow corridors, forced to collide and crumble under perfectly timed counterattacks. Infantry units attempting to flank were met with concealed barricades, crossfires, and rolling obstacles that seemed to appear as if guided by the very hand of fate. Žižka's commands, shouted with authority and clarity, carried over the din of battle, every word a spark that ignited coordinated strikes, every pause a calculated interval to manipulate the chaos. He did not need to see to know where his enemies were weakest. He felt it in the tremor of the earth beneath their advance, in the shifting weight of their numbers, and in the collective rhythm of their movements. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. To Žižka, it was a map, a story, a living organism that he navigated with the certainty of a man who had fought and survived the impossible countless times. As arrows darkened the sky and the clash of steel rang like thunder across the plains, Žižka moved among his soldiers, issuing commands, repositioning wagons, and adjusting formations with an almost supernatural awareness. He could sense where the enemy was strongest, where their momentum faltered, and where a well-timed strike could turn the tide of the entire engagement. The knights, believing that his blindness was a weakness to exploit, charged with reckless abandon, only to stumble into traps that seemed almost prophetic in their precision. Horses tripped over hidden obstacles, ranks of soldiers collided and fell into chaos, and in the midst of it all, Žižka's voice rose, calm, steady, commanding, guiding his men as if the battlefield itself answered to his will. Every swing of an axe, every discharge of a cannon, every arrow loosed from his wagons was part of a grand design, a choreography of destruction that would leave historians awestruck for centuries to come. Even without sight, Žižka's mind was sharper than the keenest blade, predicting, adapting, and exploiting the enemy with a clarity that was terrifying to witness. Hours dragged on, yet Žižka's energy never waned, for he was fueled not by vision, but by experience, determination, and an unshakable belief in the power of strategy over brute force. The battlefield became a living testament to his genius. Despite being blind, he had transformed disadvantage into absolute dominance. Knights who had laughed at his supposed weakness now lay scattered, their formations broken, their morale shattered, their pride destroyed by a man they could not comprehend. Each victory, each clever maneuver, reinforced the legend of a commander who transcended the limits of human perception, who understood that seeing with eyes was far less powerful than seeing with the mind and heart. As the dust settled and the echoes of battle faded into the distance, Žižka stood amid the remnants of chaos, unbowed, unbroken, a figure of mythic stature. He had proven that blindness was not weakness, that courage and cunning were mightier than numbers, and that a single man, guided by intellect, intuition, and unyielding resolve, could bend the course of history itself. The world had come to witness the impossible, and in the end, they saw a blind man who had become unstoppable, a man whose legend would endure far beyond the battlefield, echoing through the ages as a testament to the power of indomitable will.